I like a good pun because as a father, I take a lot of heat for my use of puns. But when I was asked to facilitate a session, and you'll see some of this content if you had the opportunity to participate in Dr. Volksberger's or Dr. Fronapple's presentation earlier, they did touch on some of the tips and some of the data-driven decision-making process. And so I was fortunate enough to be able to sit in on that session just so I could kind of see and use a point of reference for those of you who may have dipped into that session as well. So there may be some redundant topic covered in here. Again, if that's the case, I'll try and gloss over it, but we'll try and keep everybody active and engaged in the process here. So I'll go back to this real quick momentarily. So I am a supervisor in training and consultation at IU5, which is up near, we're about 20 minutes south of Lake Erie. So as Dr. Poggi mentioned, we are getting a little bit of snow, which will help me in my second job. I like to kind of double down on the PaPBS mission statement in the beginning of my sessions so that we can kind of revisit why we're engaging in some of this work and why the network is so valuable in partnering with schools and communities to do this and to do so effectively. So I won't read that. I do share that. Here's our agenda very quickly. We're going to look at different sources of data, right? So as a community, we are often very data rich and somewhat information poor. What are we actually exercising this use of data, and what is it going to do for us, right? Schools are inundated with numerous resources. And one of the things that over the last 8 years that I've experienced with some of the districts I've had the opportunity to support is that when there's high rates of turnover in staff, in administration, drift occurs. That's fairly natural. But if there's not somebody there saying, this is why we do it, and this is how it benefits us as a faculty and our students, which is our primary focus, then we lose focus and we see PBIS as maybe one of those extra things that teachers get tasked with. So if you've had the opportunity to, at any point, participate, because I know some of our coaches, by virtue of the turnover in their positions, merely inherit the role of a coach. So some of them may not have actually gone through some of the initial training that integrates some of the tips model. And then I'm going to share a few different scenarios. So some of them will be from the lens of kind of the far goals, and then we'll have some for near goals planning as well. And then again, if at any point you want to stop and ask questions, please feel free to do so. I don't take myself too seriously. I wouldn't ask anybody else to either. So feel free to drop something in the chat and we'll kind of wade through this together. So here are our objectives for this morning / afternoon as we tip into the afternoon. We're going to look at a couple planning documents, a couple data resources. I will try and share those smoothly in the chat, or I can have Dr. Poggi maybe help me out in doing so. And I'll show you a couple different places to go, share some resources, and we'll kind of go from there. So I don't know how many of you, and again, I said I didn't take myself too seriously, but tradition, and many of you may be new to the coaching role or somewhat new to the coaching role. One of the things that I often hear when I go into buildings is when I ask, well, why do you have a process in place that may not make a whole lot of sense from a time element, from the data it's generating, from the resources, human and otherwise, that it absorbs? And so I like to just kind of playfully mock some of those things, but I guess the short side was, my sister gave me a demotivational calendar years ago, and so I thematically put that into a lot of my presentation. So if we look at that previous slide where tradition, well, why do we do this? Because it's the way we've always done something. Then here is a perfect statement that should be adequately reflected in why you're struggling to get traction with change. And this is a quote that was from Edward Deming. I heard a variation of this from Dr. George Batch. If you have the privilege of listening to him or participate in any of his work, I would highly recommend it if you have not. But he has supported the state of Pennsylvania and some of their implementation of MTSS, and particularly with a focus on how to use data to drive change. So it was just one of those quotes that resonates with me, and I thought I'd share it here. So thinking about school-wide PBIS, I have framework non-negotiables, but when we have, again, being my experience, when we've had coaches that are new to the role and unfamiliar with some of the documentation, or, hey, what did I sign up for? I like to go back to base. So where can you find these things? Well, you'll see the piece at the bottom says PaPBS Network Administrative Overview. If at some point you have not had administrative turnover since you started as the coach, they should have been presented with some of this content as part of the process for onboarding for PBIS. It's important because it goes to the crux of why we're collecting data and what we're doing with it as it relates to our PBIS framework within the school. So of the 7 components that we have for PBIS, this is one of the primary ones. So number 7 is the procedures for monitoring and evaluating the effectiveness of a PBIS system. And in subsequent slides, we'll see kind of how we can do that from, again, that far reach and those near-term goals. And then we have our keys to implementation. So we know that providing support for our core team meetings, and I have monthly team/data meetings. All right, I've been in a number of schools, as anybody who's an external coach or serves in a similar role to me as TAC may have done as well. And time is that commodity that there's never enough of. It's never, it may be used effectively, it may be used ineffectively, but sometimes what I have seen, especially now following the pandemic with all of the accelerated learning processes, is we don't have enough time. So we've blended this process with this process, and that's why that's there. So do you have access to disciplinary data? Some of the buildings I've worked with over the years, you'd think this is a fairly simple task, and it has become one of the most complicated aspects of implementing an effective PBIS framework. So regular meetings with all stakeholders, again, that's a key to implementation. I know it was reiterated with in other sessions earlier today, but who are those? If our data, when we dig into some of that, is showing that our acknowledgement system is not as effective as it once was. Is that with our students? Is that our teachers? Are we soliciting feedback from those stakeholder groups? And how are we using that to inform and drive our change within our framework? And then monitor and adapt to changes in a systematic manner. If we're not doing it, then you'll see kind of the chaos that ensues. And I don't have it on this slide, and maybe it'll be something that I populate to the Padlet, but or drop into the chat later. There's a graphical representation that was created by Dr. Tim Noster, or adapted by Dr. Tim Noster, from who supports Pennsylvania's implementation and the McDowell Institute. I believe at Shippensburg, if I'm not mistaken. It kind of looks at if you have a missing component somewhere along the process, what the response is, the human response is typically from a team-based perspective. And it's a nice visual representation. I didn't share it here, but I will, because if you're looking at data effectively, then you and all of these different component pieces, your implementation is going to be far more effective. There we go. So I also integrated the images, because when we say as coaches, well, where is this? Why do we have to have this here? I go back to our Fidelity tools. You know, the network has shifted to the use of the TFI for those schools that are going for first-time recognition or have been recognized and are building their tiered systems of support. But it's also integrated into those 53 components that you'll find in the benchmarks of quality. And so, you know, if you get, again, the reason I put this in here, if you get pushback from your teammates or your staff or your administration, this is where you want to go to say, here's what it is, here are some possible sources of data that we can use, and this is why it's in there. So again, use the resources that you have and that you're required to use as part of implementation, formal implementation of the PBIS framework. So we're going to look at a few more data sources. And again, I have various visual representations to kind of illustrate the process and why it's so important as we kind of unpack this material. So I have summative data here, right? And my graphic image on the side is deliberate in nature because, yes, I realize that it is not spelled, but at the summit, you get this kind of global picture of what's happening, right? And so in PBIS, we have summative data, and it's valuable in driving our framework. It's valuable for planning purposes, but we need to be mindful of how we use it, when we're using it, what we're doing with it, when it does generate some questions. And so that's why I have it as, it is really that global long-term planning piece that we're looking at when we're looking at summative data. So some of our data sources within PBIS, if you're not already familiar with them, these are considerations, and the school climate survey is on PBIS apps. The self-assessment survey is an annual requirement with at least 80% participation from your teaching staff. And this is one of my favorite activities to conduct with schools. So I share this data with them, but without some kind of context or connection, the message is often lost. So we know that the self-assessment survey is broken into 4 different components. So we're looking at school-wide systems, we're looking at non-classroom, classroom, and individual school systems. What we don't do oftentimes is take this tool and say, how does this impact our implementation? Well, if you have 80% of your staff completing this, that's the qualitative feedback long-term. And if you're building his implemented, now you may be somewhat new to coaching within the context of where you work, but maybe they've implemented for long periods of time and you're just not totally aware of what's happened before you got there, or maybe you want a broader perspective on implementation through the years. This is a great tool because it looks at qualitative feedback from your staff year over year over year, depending on how long you've implemented. If you're just now implementing, it's base, right? It's your baseline data so that you can build from there, and it helps for planning purposes. But the next image that you'll see is an activity that I like to do, and one that I did with one of my local buildings recently, is they had been implementing for at least 3 years. So I'll take this data and I'll print it out, and then I'll put it side by side so that they can see when they're starting to say, well, our staff doesn't buy in, or our staff doesn't do this, or we're struggling here or here. We can actually see the change in what the staff is actually reporting versus what you're hearing. So we want to kind of really go back to, what is our data telling us? And how is that going to inform conversations with our colleagues? So this is the activity that I do. So you'll look at the far left. So we're going left to right, thankfully. Although I have had buildings go from what would be the right to the left. And I'll put this data out, and if nothing else, as an external coach working with my coaches, I can use it to generate conversations around, okay, so you're telling me that you're getting a lot of disciplinary referrals coming from a general location. So let's look at our school-wide systems or our non-classroom settings. What are our teachers reporting? And especially for buildings that have some degree of stability in their teaching staffs year over year, this is a fabulous exercise that can be done with the team initially to say, here's some questions, here's some data we found, and then share that with their faculty. Because again, as it was mentioned in other sessions, one of the primary ways to gain and then maintain buy-in is sharing the data. So we're asking of our teachers to complete these surveys, and going back to time being a precious commodity, we want their time to be perceived as being well used to help support the implementation of our framework. So I would encourage you, if you don't have access to these, where can you get access, or can your external coach support this effort? And if you have any thoughts or questions on that, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Or again, I'm not terribly formal, so feel free to unmute. So I mentioned our Fidelity tools. For those just implementing, or maybe you're just out of Universal, our previous practices, building coaches. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Lawson. Yes. So if you look in the chat, we can add building coaches to PBIS apps so you can see those reports. Going back to my previous statement, if you've just gone through Universal, our previous tool was one time we implement the team implementation checklist, also known as the TIC, and then we start building. Now that's an item, if you've never seen it, I'm not going to go into too much detail at this point, but it has 22 items and 22 associated action steps. And again, it's kind of scaled as to where you're at with implementation, if something started, not started, etc. But our Fidelity tools that we use for reflection of where we're at are the benchmarks of quality and the tiered fidelity inventory. And we're looking at these for purposes of summative. These tools are fabulous, but they're not going to inform our day-to-day operations per se, as we're looking at behavior data or as we're looking at other data points that will inform our implementation or inform our interventions that we're using in different settings. But these are fabulous tools and required tools for participation in the network, action planning, and submission for our annual recognition process, whether you're a participant or you're at some level of recognition already for your framework. Another tool that I think is invaluable and not one that is frequently visited, because our annual school profile data is due, I believe, and please someone correct me if I'm wrong, is due by June 30th for this year for completion of our applications and recognition process for next year. But one of those tools that I have found for schools that are experiencing pushback or experiencing resistance within their faculty is it working? What are our efforts actually bearing fruit? So this is a tool that I like to use. This is 5 years of implementation in one of our local LEAs. And when they started, their baseline data was fairly significant. I mean, we're talking almost 6,400 referrals during a school year.
Conferring each other, looking
and
I realized what they were doing was.
There we go. And then we looked at their implementation. So as they strengthened their tier 1 framework, and as they strengthened their implementation, they were able to reduce the number of office disciplinary referrals for their office. They were also able to reduce, once they got a handle on the reporting process, their number of referrals to special ed for newly identified. Now, this is an old slide. We're not actually reporting on LRE data anymore because the state has enough, as was shared by Dr. Tim Runge, who aggregates a lot of that data and, or disaggregates a lot of that data. But I put this here because it is another source of planning. It's another source to say, is this working? Is it worth our time? Yes, no. How's it impacting other aspects of our district, our building? And, you know, looking at those referrals to special ed, are we utilizing core instructional practices and core tier 1 universal behavior practices that are being effective for our students? And here's data to prove it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but they can be added to see some of this data in P-TRAC as the building coach, if I'm not mistaken.
So this is typically a local facilitator task, but we do have those collaborative opportunities, but the facilitator would be the ultimate person that would populate that and link that with the recognition.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to see clarification because I knew we can add them to the district. So
correct. And
or the district coach.
That district coach role is one that we're trying to cultivate more and more. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. But again, it's if you've not familiarized yourself with it, or let's say, you know, due to the time frame in which it's usually reported, which is the close of a school year, if you've not seen it, and a building administrator is usually on the hook for reporting this, it's worth a conversation so that you're fully informed from a coach's role, internal coach's role. So again, with my play on words here, so formative data in school-wide PBIS, and yes, I know there's no hyphen in formative, but formative being dual purpose in this, in that we're looking at the form that the behavior is taking and kind of addressing some of those things from a systematic perspective. And also when we're meeting, as far as the TIPS meeting model is concerned, there is a form associated with that, and one that has been adapted through the years for different purposes. Personally, as one of the initiatives that I'm supporting right now with the Pathways to Graduation, we have used an adapted form of the TIPS model for that as well. And I know, again, this was mentioned earlier. I'm getting ahead of myself. It was mentioned earlier, and I'll share it with you, or I'll take you down the path as to where you can find this. And let me momentarily pull up the Working Smarter, Harder, Not Harder document, because I don't believe that I linked that in there. So let me drop that in the chat. Okay. Okay, so for those of you that have participated in Schoolwide for a hot second, the Working Smarter, Not Harder matrix is something that we have used during our universal training. And it's something that I have revisited with teams that have experienced a high level of turnover at the building level or administrative level, specifically the team level. And I've found it to be an invaluable tool to generate conversations with fellow team members for your PBIS team, or again, across different teams that may exist within the building that are collecting data or having conversations that may provide more insight in the work that the Tier 1 Universal team is conducting. So has anybody seen this? And you can drop in the chat, have you completed this activity before in the past? If so, did you find it valuable? Okay. So the link I dropped in the chat is, thanks, Catherine. The link I dropped in the chat will take you to this document. And my initial thought was that we could populate it collectively just to see what folks are doing. Or maybe you're using a particular model or team function that is operating at a different level than somebody else is using a similar task. But from my own personal experience, and one of the reasons I revisit this as part of our data, understanding where our data is coming from process, is that I had as a case manager and a former special ed teacher, former emotional support teacher in my district, many of the students that were receiving additional levels of support, whether it be some form of a check-in, check-out, or they had been referred to SAP, I didn't have any insight. So when I was trying to support my regular ed teachers with implementation of a positive behavior support plan, sometimes things kind of came out of left field that I wasn't aware of. So I was fortunate enough to sit on my SAP team for a couple of years, and in doing so, found the value in knowing what else is happening within my buildings around intervention. So I populate this, and we look at universal school-wide PBIS. Who are those folks that are participant to that? What tier of support is it? And what are we looking at from that perspective? So again, it helps inform the work. Again, I mentioned the Pathways to Graduation initiative, where they're looking at early warning systems to inform intervention and supports for students that are identified with emotional disturbance in middle school to help improve graduation rates. So in that early warning system, we're looking at attendance, grades, behavior incidences, and math and ELA, and how that all informs our different teams. So any thoughts on this for those that have used it? I want to make sure to give adequate wait time. It's also helpful that I have my camera minimized so I can't see myself. All right. I don't want to hang out too long, but again, I would encourage you as a new coach or a newer coach or new to the role to sit down and say, where are we at? What do we have going? Who has access to that data and information? Because when we look at type of data discussed and we look at behavioral ODRs, referrals, there are multiple systems that we may be pulling some of that information from. And if we don't have access to it, then everything else is futile because we're not using that to inform our interventions and create precise statements. So here we go. It feeds from the previous statement. Go ahead and drop in the chat. What student information system does your school use? Swiss, Infinite Campus, Sapphire, Synergy. I've not heard that. Power School. I see. Power School and Swiss. All right. Skyward. Link it. Okay. So some of those I'm familiar with, some of them not. Most of the schools in our region use either Power School or Infinite Campus. And I like to say that I found Infinite Campus to be infinitely frustrating in generating reports, but I've understood that they've made some data changes to allow for an early warning data system, kind of an ad hoc piece. So secondary question, do you have access as the building coach to your dashboard, whether you're using Swiss, and their dashboard and their input system for data entry? And do you know how to run the reports? Yes, yes, thank you. Woohoo! No access. Okay, that could be a conversation. No. Okay. Can enter information but can't get reports, right? So that may be by virtue of how your system is set up. But I always ask this question because when we start to look at root cause analysis for maybe why we're not as successful as we possibly could be, a lot of it sometimes has to do with what information do we need? What information do we have access to? And if those things are not fully aligned, then it makes it very difficult to complete our tasks. And I'll give you an example. One of the buildings that I have, and I think this was mentioned earlier, a lot of our buildings with that have utilized Swiss, which is such an invaluable tool, had a lot of administrative turnover, had team turnover. The building administrator was entering all of the referrals because of the way it had originally been formatted for them. And they left mid-year and nobody had access and referrals were mounting up. They weren't able to inform their intervention with the newest data that was coming in. So if you don't have this access, I would encourage you, and I may take heat for this afterwards, but I would encourage you to talk to your building administrator and say, hey, should I have access to this? If I don't, what are those steps? A lot of times as an external facilitator, I have the ability to add things through if you utilize something like Swiss, but if not, and you're using Infant Campus or PowerSchool or Links or some other different tools, what access do you have? What do you need? And how are you using the data if you don't have access to it? Because when we get into the TIPS model and we start looking at a few component pieces of that, it's important to have backups to different roles. So if somebody who's typically responsible for entering data or generating results is not available and you're the backup, you may be out of luck for that meeting. So just those things I like to put out there for consideration. Other considerations with our data entry, right? We need to be consistent. That example that I mentioned a moment ago. Okay, so I see somebody's using Google Forms. Oh, I actually recognize that name. Hi, Michelle. Yes, so lots of valuable tools. I've seen some very creative things come from Google Suites that actually mirror a lot of the data that we need to pull for informing our PBIS framework and our interventions. So yeah, I'm not here to tell you what you're doing is wrong, but if you don't have access to it, it's a conversation that I would encourage you to have with your building administration or those relevant stakeholders. Data entry. That example that I used where there was a building administrator putting all of these in and they left the district, they had a problem. No one was putting them in because no one had access to it. So they couldn't use it to drive or inform their interventions and practices. So best practice would be to train several people in doing that so that you have somebody who knows how to enter those office disciplinary referral forms if they're not already in some digital format. And then it allows you to generate more realistic, accurate information as you process pieces. Because for those of you who may have been around long enough to look at previous Fidelity Tools, the Schoolwide evaluation tool required that you had quick access to graphable data. And I would argue that if you don't have graphable data and a visual representation, it's very difficult sometimes to see change over time. So again, previous session, somebody mentioned sharing the data. Share it monthly. Many of our LEAs have gotten very skilled at taking 3 to 5 minutes at a faculty meeting, either in the morning or at the very end of the afternoon, and just sharing some of their data that has happened, that has occurred. If any of my participants right now have some clever ways that they've been able to do this, while still maintaining the integrity of the data and the confidentiality that may be necessary under certain circumstances, please feel free to drop that in the chat. Right, we're a community of practice here, so we want to kind of support one another. Major attentions. I'm sorry, I'm scanning the chat here too. Yes, consistency is key. It was great that you were able to problem solve that. And again, sometimes it's something very minute that throws off the whole process. Fidelity checks of our interventions. What data are the data accurate? A lot of times in Swiss, it's been my experience for those of you that utilize that resource. Sometimes there's a duplication, sometimes there's a name change, and sometimes that can throw off our data reports. Are we overwriting or underwriting ODRs? This is an interesting topic because when we start to look at the data, are we underreporting actual things so that our collective year-end data doesn't reflect disproportionality or doesn't reflect what is actually happening in the building? Or are we over-reporting and we think that by writing the office disciplinary referral, that is in and of itself an intervention, which of course is not, but I have experienced buildings that they believe that is the intervention by writing the ODR because it creates a paper trail. And again, that's not its intended purpose. And are you being consistent in writing and the definitions of behavior? Again, one of the activities, and it's one that I'll give credit to one of my colleagues, one of the activities that we like to facilitate is if we're seeing a lot of referrals for behavior or for disruption or disrespect, whether it's minor or major, we like to have there's an activity we can have teachers create their own definition of what that looks like. And then the team can kind of sort out the commonalities and then shape a conversation around what that is, because as much as our students often need retraining, so too do our staff, especially when there's a high rate of turnover. So are we all on the same page with this? Get feedback. There are many clever ways of getting informal feedback from faculty, from getting it from students, from community members. Again, bringing in that relevant stakeholder piece. I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but when we're looking at facilitating our meetings and we're looking at the efficiency of that process, do we have our data? Is it in, again, I mentioned the graphable format. Are we getting it in a timely manner? And is it going to help inform our precise statements, which we'll look at here in a minute? And again, if you've participated in the most recent modules of universal training, this is pulled directly from that site. But it's a nice kind of checklist of things to consider as we look at our planning and use of data systems. Sorry, there may be too many animations here, but tips. Just by, we'll say a show, when I say a show of hands, but in the chat, do you utilize the tips model in your building currently? Or we'll say an effective meeting practice that allows us to kind of adhere to a specific process that generates positive outcomes? Not yet. Okay. All right. For those of you that were just trained and starting to incorporate it, how's it going? And you can put it in the chat if you don't want to unmute. Could use more practice. I love the honesty. Yes, candor is key. Rocky. Okay, right. So it is a process. It is a formal training to implement the TIPS model, and it does take some practice. I know, again, as was shared in a previous session, there are some kind of guiding videos that accompany the TIPS model. And it does take some practice. It was originally integrated into and is still integrated into one of the training modules for universal schools, but it does take some time. And thinking about tradition, that may not be the manner in which you've facilitated meetings in the past. So it does take a bit. It was also mentioned, and let's see if I need to, okay, I shouldn't. It was mentioned that you can find this in the Coaches Corner. So for those of you that may not have visited this resource, this is a readily accessible resource from the PaPBS network. And all of the things that were mentioned in a previous session are available to you here. So tips 2 for coaches, meeting monsters. Yes, and it truly has over the years, and I know one of our members that was mentioned earlier, Marie Bazzelli, I believe, oversees the development and management of this website in many ways, and so I'm sure that it has gotten so much better through the years, and the resources are rich. And again, I like to show folks where those are at sometimes. So if you wanted any of that tips coaching piece, it's in here. All right, and we're going to go back to our original session. So again, just a quick, there it is. The resources are accessible. You don't need a login to access them. So TIPS model, these are our roles and responsibilities. So who's our facilitator, our data analyst, our minute taker, our timekeeper, and who are those team members that are relevant for our meeting? I just facilitated a P2G meeting the other day, and as I alluded to earlier, we utilize a TIPS-like format for this. So myself or my colleague at Patton, Bob Shields, that I get to work with, often facilitate these meetings. I rely on our building administrator that we work with to generate the data that we're going to be looking at and talking about. I often am the minute taker. Our timekeeper is one of our team members, and we look at participation. Now, this is the one thing that in all of my P2G schools, having backups for our roles in these particular instances is not always one of those luxuries that we have. But I would encourage you, if you're going to be implementing a TIPS model, always have a backup. I mean, one of our colleagues likes to use kind of the lottery test. If you won the lottery tomorrow and just decided to quit, does somebody else in the building know how to do your job? Or if you're on a team, do they know what your role is and how to support that role without a big lift from their end? So here's our TIPS meeting guide. And if you haven't seen it, it can be a little visually overwhelming at first, but I can assure you that once you get accustomed to the process and where you're going to house these, it's truly an invaluable tool to shape the conversations, keep them on task, and generate actionable steps to improve your PBIS implementation. So let's start by funneling. Maybe not this, but when we don't do it adequately, it's about as chaotic as a process when we're looking at implementation of PBIS. So what are our problem behaviors and what's reflected in our ODR data? And if you don't have access to your ODR data, again, that's a conversation. When are our problem behaviors occurring? Where are they occurring? Who's engaged in these problems? And what do we think is being maintaining these behaviors? Now, in the process of this, the why becomes that perceived motivation. So just a cautionary piece before we move on. Perceived motivation could be an all-day training of it in and of itself, because a lot of folks looking at function of behavior don't fully understand what that means when they input that in on a referral form, whether it's paper-based or digital or otherwise. So just case in point, I went into a building that was utilizing Swiss years ago, and what I found out was that they weren't, the educators that were informing that data were not clear on what perceived motivation looked like. And so a lot of the students that were receiving special ed services and had a PBSP, a positive behavior support plan, the hypothesis statement that informs those interventions, we're saying, you know, we believe the hypothesis and the function of the behavior is adult attention seeking behavior, or whatever the case is. It's the teachers, it was unknown was the perceived motivation across the board for most of the referrals that were being entered. If they don't understand what we think is maintaining it, then our intervention is likely going to be misaligned when we're rolling it out. So again, might be a conversation as a coach. If you start to see that in your data, you know, what training might you need, or what, you know, reach out to your external facilitator if that makes more sense. But again, just one of those things to give consideration to. But we want to take those pieces and we want to feed it into a precise statement. So in doing so, again, this is a pretty, we'll say, universal example. And these are something that you might have practiced if you participated in the universal training. We, as a practice, will often marvel at different things, and we can talk about them until we're blue in the face. But I like to say, if you don't have the data to prove it, you're just another person with an opinion. So we need to move from these primary statements to a precise statement. And when doing so, we can take some of those or take one of those and we can go, all right, here's what we're looking at. We're looking at more ODRs for aggression, rather than, you know, we've got some angry little kiddos. They're happening on the playground during first recess, large number, right? It's the whole clue aspect. And again, I know that was redundant for those of you who may have participated in a previous session from this morning, but it bears mentioning. It's a similar process. Here's where we kind of, this is where a lot of work happens in the background too. So I receive this as an external coach. Oftentimes I receive this question. So what do we address first? You know, the behavior is telling us all these things. The behavior from the bus is just outrageous. And, you know, that's one of those environments that we have limited control over. So what can we do? I always encourage, whether I'm talking about it from a PBIS perspective, behavior, or classroom management perspective, how is it a concern for safety? You know, are people feeling unsafe? Is the behavior unsafe? And if you can answer that, that's probably how you want to go about prioritizing and addressing that as a potential problem first. Frequency, how often is it occurring? And this is a big one. You know, again, perceptually, we think things are bigger than they are. Is the data telling us that it's a bigger issue than it is? And if not, where can we prioritize our efforts? Frequency, or the trend, is it trending upwards? Is it trending downwards? If it's trending downwards, we can't explain why. Maybe that's a place that we want to have a discussion. And then pattern, is there a specific pattern or frequency of problem behavior? And sometimes these are very nuanced with data, but when we can look at it over time, like, okay, we know that in December or November, with short calendars for schools in most cases, we often see spikes in behavior as we go towards those holiday seasons. Is that a trend that happens year over year? Is that a pattern that's just now taking place? And when we look at it from kind of a student level, do we have students that are showing behaviors at certain times of day, certain days of the week? If so, can we start filtering the questions to see what's happening during those times? And I'll show you a couple for the sake of time, because I think we have about 8 minutes or so. I'm going to skip this activity because I want to show some data. Again, my favorite aspect of engaging in PBIS is looking at data over long periods of time for sake of implementation, particularly for my buildings that have been implementing and maybe struggling to get to a higher level of fidelity, or maybe they're sustaining, but there's been some drift, or they're barely sustaining something. So I like to look at data over time. So I'm going to show you a couple data sets here, and I'm going to ask you a couple questions at the end, and we'll kind of go from there. So the data I'm about to share it's anonymous, redacted data from an LEA, and it's year over year by looking at a class. So we'll take this, oftentimes I hear this kindergarten class is terrible. This third grade class doesn't know how to behave, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a 4-year period, and we're going to look at our total ODRs were 561, and we had 104 in kindergarten. Okay. So following year, our referrals are still going down, but those kindergartners are now in 1st grade, and there's still a high level of office disciplinary referrals. Still going down in referrals, and now our 1st graders that were high are our 2nd graders that are high for office disciplinary referrals. Still going down, but are still maintaining their high levels of office disciplinary referrals now as 3rd graders. So over the past 4 years, this particular grade has maintained that. So this says talk amongst yourselves, but think about it for a moment. What are the questions that you may generate based on that, based on what we know? So we know that our overall ODRs are coming down, and that our ODRs for this particular group were high in every year from when they entered school in kindergarten until 3rd grade when I stopped the data set. What other information might be helpful that we can consider for an appropriate intervention? And go ahead and drop that in the chat if you want. Number of referrals. Yes, great question. Is that overrepresentation like one of the previous ones? Perfect. How many students make up those referrals? Yep. Has there been teachers that complete the entire school week? Which is a great insight, because I just had a conversation with a building recently where one of their faculty members took a number of sick days before retirement. And so there was a teacher in this particular classroom, a different teacher in the particular classroom almost daily. And that can impact behavior, that can impact learning, all sorts of things. Yep. Right, transience is a consideration. How we define things, teachers revisited basic rules. Perfect, I love it. Thank you so much for the feedback. Yeah, I really I put these in here to generate thought-provoking experiences. Gender or race, right? So we could break that down. We have, again, I use Swiss only I'm not pushing Swiss as a product, but I use it because that's what I have access to, and what I support some of my buildings in. There's an ethnicity report in that. That's very helpful. There's a lot of year-end reports that are helpful in looking at comparison to national averages, disproportionality, et cetera. So yeah, it's really just intended to be a thought-provoking process here. So let's look at our scenario 2. We're going to look at grade school year to school year. So this is a slightly different experience, but we can see in second grade, so we have almost 400 referrals at this point, and we have most of them concentrated at second grade. So here's the following year. We have slightly less referrals, but they're also concentrated at second grade. You kind of see where I'm going with this one. Our referrals have spiked. This is kind of an anomaly, right? They're at second grade. Yes, teachers. And I'll and I don't know if that was relative to the last reading a statement that was in the chat, whether that's relevant to the last scenario or this one, but you'll get the idea here pretty quick. Again, our referrals are going down, but they're still very high at second grade. Do the second grade staff need to be retrained? Yeah, possibly. But this is one of those sticky wickets that teams will sometimes find, is that, or maybe they already know intuitively that there's somebody within their grade team that overrepresents, or maybe that particular teacher has a student that's overrepresenting. So here's some of our data points that we gave consideration to. Where do they happen, right? Do they need more support in the classroom? Do the students need more support? Does the educator need support? Here's my second question. Is the discussion, does it need administrative support? Is the administrator already aware of this? And if so, how are they articulating that to the team when they see this? Because invariably somebody will encounter this scenario as the longer you become a coach, the more you'll know. Perhaps maybe we need to look at lesson plans. Have they been utilized and implemented with fidelity? If it is at the teacher level, great questions. How might we shape this discussion in our team meetings? So those are two of the scenarios that I've encountered. This is a tool that I believe is linked. As a new coach, it's kind of a year at a glance. As I reviewed this, oddly enough, it's still aligned quite well with, is there turnover? Yep. Still great questions and comments. I appreciate the discussion in the chat. This is a tool that you can use to help kind of guide some of your processes. It's kind of an adapted version of something that existed in the network years ago, and it's been kind of updated. You'll see Fidelity Tools, the tick is there, but if you've already gone through Universal, you're not using the tick. We're not using the school safety survey anymore because it's been archived by PBIS apps. But this is a tool that some of my teams have found useful for planning purposes. Hey, I'm new to coaching, or hey, still getting a handle on it. I could really use something that helps form and structure what I need to be doing. So we break it down by quarter. What are those information materials we might need? What does that planning phase look like? And what are some action steps that we can come away with? Again, it's not the end all be all. It is just a nice resource to have in your hip pocket. So these were our objectives for today. I think I have reached, were we at 12:30? Dr. Poggi, I believe.
Yes, that is correct. And you're doing awesome, right on time.
All right. So again, here's my contact information. I do value the networking and community that I've been so fortunate to be a part of over the last 8 years with PaPBS network, and I so appreciate the work building coaches do. And if there is any support that we can ever provide or communicate with, feel free to reach out. I would be happy to have a conversation, and thank you for your participation today.